All you need is love, sang the Beatles in 1967. That song feels good, doesn't it? We enjoy it. Unfortunately, it's not true. Right? The summer of free love, of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, of love the one you're with, all of it isn't true. It's a lie. It's equally untrue when we say it today in our contemporary phrasing. Love wins. Love is love. Love trumps hate. All of it just as false. And yet, Jesus looks at the man in the gospel reading with love, telling him he lacks one thing. So why should I say all of that? Our culture's idea of love is not the same as Jesus's. For us, love is a sense of personal fulfillment and inner affirmation. I know that I love, fill in the blank, because of how good it makes me feel, goes our contemporary logic. And if I don't enjoy how I feel, love must be lacking in the situation. Sounds silly when we spell it out that way, doesn't it? Now, the man in the story surely loves something, but it surely seems he's loving something the wrong way. Loving the wrong things and loving things the wrong way is not a new idea for humans. Right? The great works of human literature, the Odyssey and the Iliad, Job and Ecclesiastes, King Arthur and Shakespeare included, confront this very idea of what it is to love and what objects are to be loved. It just sounds really strange to us today in a time where serious thought is reduced to 168 characters or less on the internet. Love is love. Love yourself more. All of which means, love is what I say love means, just like Humpty Dumpty in Alice in Wonderland. Now maybe you don't, but I love to talk about stewardship. Yeah, we know, Pastor. All you do is talk about money. Money, money, money. Right? Well, that's a lie. I rarely talk about money. Two big exceptions to that are, one, my own personal Dave Ramsey Financial Peace University story, and two, when Property Commission asked for money unexpectedly to renovate the landscaping this year. But perhaps you should know that one of the topics Jesus talked most about, in fact, he used this topic most of all to talk about the kingdom of heaven, was money and finances. Now, I do talk a lot about stewardship, which, as many of you know by now, is using God's gifts for God's purposes. Well, Pastor, I don't see the difference. Maybe I can phrase it this way. Maybe I can put it this way. I once knew a man who knew the price of everything, but the worth of nothing. He and his family, he had taught his family to do the same. They could tell me what they paid for anything and what they could sell it for. But, at least around me, they couldn't talk about God's purpose to radically change their lives and the lives they touched for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The most he could say, that man, was something very self-satisfied like, "The Lord's been good to me." That's the difference between talking about money and talking about stewardship. Money is merely dollars and cents for one's own profit and loss. Stewardship is using God's gifts for God's purposes. Both are important. Both involve faithfulness and faithlessness. One sets the bar like the man in the story. How much must I do? Can we negotiate the price? The other joins Jesus on his mission in everyday life, joyfully. In fact, that's our stewardship program theme for today, joy. And we'll hear more from Warren about that in a little bit. And most specifically, joy from receiving God's blessings. Now, Epicurus, the Greek philosopher, said, "If you want to make a man happy, add not to his riches, but take away from his desires." So I'm going to modify what Epicurus said to this. If you want to make a man happy for a short time, add to his riches. But if you want to make a man joyful, content, and at peace, take away from his desires. The man in our gospel story was sorrowful and grieving because he desired more achievements and accomplishments and pats on the back of his own, all the way to the kingdom of heaven. He couldn't receive the kingdom as an undeserved gift that surpassed the price of all his stuff. When it comes to stewardship, I truly believe if we're honest with ourselves, we often cringe when the annual stewardship emphasis is upon us. We think that now here come those sermons on how we should give our time, our talents, and especially our money to God. That's not what stewardship is. So often we think of stewardship as us giving to God with a special focus on material things. This is not stewardship. Stewardship begins and ends with our realizing what God has given to us and the joy and peace and contentment that come from this. Period. It's the gospel. For God so loved the world that he gave. That he gave, not we gave. That he gave his one and only Son to die for us on the cross. That's God's love, active and on display, given for the whole world to see, and then to trust, to know, and to give allegiance to. There was an article making the rounds last week from the New York Times that explained the author's reason for her divorce, her conscious uncoupling, as they say these days. Now, her reason wasn't any moral failure from her or her husband, nor was it the old-fashioned falling out of love, irreconcilable differences. She loves her now ex-husband, but she had no joy. She realized that she loved herself more than everything else. She could find no joy, a bit like the man in our story, whose loves were disordered, not loving God first. For them, love is a zero-sum proposition. A fixed amount must be divided among subjects according to one's priorities, including me first. On a fundamental level, it becomes about trust. In what do we place our trust? In God and his provision for us? Or perhaps it's all the benefits accrued by behaving a certain way, like the man in the gospel story. Maybe it's something else, such as our own ability to care for ourselves and look out for number one. All of our self-pride and self-justification, self-righteousness, selfishness, self-esteem, self-congratulation, self-sufficiency, and self-improvement. Or maybe it's all those A's or all those P's in life. Affirmation, approval, acceptance, action, accomplishment, achievement. Pride, power, privilege, position, prestige, pedigree, passion, purpose, personality, and politics. You and I both know people that are wealthier than we are. And almost all of you are wealthier than me and my family, even by multiples of 10. Like that old story about the pulpit committee. When searching for the new pastor, they prayed, "Lord, send us a pastor who's poor and humble. You keep him humble, we'll keep him poor." But right there exposes the deception of wealth. As long as we know someone who has more, we're not really wealthy. Just ask us. Our wealth, economic, social, political, personal, casts a long, dark shadow. And we can't see the darkness around us and in us until some light shines. That's why Jesus says it's easier to thread a needle with a camel than for a rich person to enter the pearly gates. And then, in the gospel story, comes from Jesus that little initial flicker of light that exposes and overcomes the darkness. For mortals it's impossible, but not for God. For God all things are possible. Notice how Jesus looks to the rich man with love. God's own love, because Jesus is God's own Son, not our psychological feel-good sense of pop culture love. Martin Luther describes it this way: the love of God, which lives in man, loves sinners, evil persons, fools, and weaklings, in order to make them righteous, good, wise, and strong. Rather than seeking its own good, the love of God flows forth and bestows good. God's love is one-sided and overflowing, never seeking what it can get out of another, but transforming the beloved into a recipient of mercy. Having been given God's grace, love, and mercy in Jesus on his cross, we are recreated as ones who receive these very gifts. Faith is formed within us, and we begin to trust God, to know him, and to give our allegiance to him. We learn to love as he first loved us, not seeking to get something back from God or seeking to repay or pay off God either. What was impossible for us has become possible by God, as our love is properly ordered, first to God and the enjoyment of him, and second, to use and to get a benefit from earthly things. A reversal of how we approach life. Notice how that's baked into our definition of stewardship. Using God's gifts for God's purposes. The things of this life are to be used for the purposes of mercy and caring for the world, loving those around us. The rich man in the story stands as a warning of what happens when our love is disordered, to enjoy the stuff and to use God. Yet Jesus makes possible what's impossible for us, to love God, who first loves us with mercy, and to enjoy him, while our stuff, his gifts to us, are used for his purposes. Amen.